Okay, so I am going to talk about increasing HLS resilience with the new HLS content steering specification. I had obviously felt a little bit wordy when I wrote this title, and maybe not writing the most exciting title. So if I could change this title today, I would change it to "How I Persuaded Apple to Change HLS." So, a little bit about me, in case you didn't know me. No, we'll skip over this slide. A little bit about us. No, we'll skip over this slide as well. Okay, we'll just talk about the thing I'm supposed to be talking about, which is resilience in the context of segmented streaming. I broke this down into two fundamental components, and that's reliability. So let's make it work as much of the time as possible, even when things are in a bit of a weird situation, and redundancy, which is let's have several of this thing we can switch between as seamlessly as possible. Multi-CDN is fundamentally a great first step for a redundancy model. This generally breaks down to two components, multi-CDN for your manifests and multi-CDN for your media. I will overwhelmingly talk about multi-CDN for media today. There's a bunch of great CDNs on the market. You should at this point be using many of them if you care about end user quality of experience. But a true resilience and redundancy story isn't just about multi-CDN. It's about multiple origins, redundant ingest, single chain resilience, and resilient transcode as well. I'm not going to get into depth on those today. There is a really good primer from the AWS team from Demux 2019 that talks about kind of full chain redundancy and resilience patterns. I do recommend watching that if you're interested in this subject. So let's talk about multi-CDN in the context of HLS streaming. So I see there as kind of three ways to do multi-CDN with HLS. The first is simple multi-CDN, second is DNS-based multi-CDN, and the third is multi-CDN using HLS redundant streams. These all work quite differently. Simple CDN generally is picking a media CDN when the manifest is requested. This either requires a smart manifest service that's capable of making that decision, or having multiple manifest endpoints and picking which CDN you're going to pick slightly higher up the chain, maybe in your playback API stack. This might be driven by QE or QoS data, but it might also be driven by money. You might want to pick CDNs based on commits with different CDNs and cost optimization. Generally, this approach does not have midstream CDN switching. Some implementations do achieve this using player plugins, but it's not always necessary. Then there's DNS-based multi-CDN. If you remember the company Sodexis primarily built this. Companies like NS1 build this. In this case, all segments are requested for a common CNAME, and that CNAME moves between different CDNs based on QoS and QE. This provides some level of midstream switching, but it's a big headache when it comes to setting up CDN tokens. It's hard to manage those consistently across multiple CDNs. But I'd also highlight that DNS TTLs and caching of DNS TTLs are imperfect. I know of set-top boxes and smart TVs that make a terrible job of caching DNS entries. And then there's HLS redundant streams, which is an old, not particularly well documented part of a HLS spec. You put all your different CDNs in the manifest, the streams look identical. I'll talk a bit more about what that means in a second, and the player can treat them as a redundant set. But this failover is client-side, and it's inconsistently implemented across players. And generally players are only going to fail over here in kind of a catastrophic failover. Like if that segment, returns a 500 3 times, okay, we might trigger a failover to an alternate CDN. This is how this looks. This will become important down the road, I promise. The attributes on these two playlists are identical for bandwidth, for codecs, and resolution, so a player can treat these as a redundant set on different CDNs. They're effectively the same, and if you give this manifest to the overwhelming amount of video players, they'll represent this as kind of one bitrate in the bitrate switch. So now I want to tell a bit of a story about making HLS better for everyone. February 12th, 2021, nearly Valentine's Day, not quite. Apple announces a conference call with two new features on the HLS interest list. Those two new features are interstitials and content steering. Now, caring a lot more about resiliency than I do ad fill, I cared far more about the content steering piece of this. February 18th, I actually missed most of a conference call. I think I was talking at another conference or a meetup or something. But Apple announced content steering, HLS content steering it's called. This adds a new steering manifest for HLS specification, which returns the domains that content can be served over. It also provides a method to inject the fundamental domain names of the CDN, but also of the authentication tokens into templated variables in HLS manifests. If you haven't seen a templated HLS manifest before, this might look a little bit weird to you, but we're defining two variables in here, the domain and the authentication token. We're actually effectively using those as defaults. There is then a new tag, which is the content steering manifest URL, and also then we can use those variables in the URL we construct to a CDN endpoint. The content steering manifest itself is actually a JSON blob, contains a list of different pathways that can be used, and what the domain and authentication token would be for either of those endpoints. So this is version 1. There's also a little bit of magic in here around gathering data from the steering manifest itself. So every time the steering manifest is refreshed, you get updates on which pathway is being used and a measure of the last throughput for that pathway. So the cool thing is, this being a more modern change for HLS spec, the community got to give a lot of feedback. So we gave feedback. So the pros, hey, this is pretty easy to conceptually understand, and it works really well with multi-CDN based tokens. But the cons are really structured around the fact it uses HLS template variables, which a lot less players support than Apple would like right now. It's fine on the Apple ecosystem, it's much less complete on the web player ecosystem, for example, which means there's ultimately limited backwards compatibility for this approach. So that feedback went off to Apple. And on March the 5th, Apple said, hey, okay, here's an updated version of the spec. We're going to replace the prefix syntax of the variables with a prefix syntax. Now, this is kind of interesting. It's effectively a regex, right? So you still have your content steering manifest address, but instead you add a template which includes kind of prefixes. So it says, hey, the end of prefixes / videos, and then you can refer to those prefixes inside your content steering manifest. So it effectively replaces everything to the left of the / videos in this case. This is pretty cool, because, hey, actually, this is backwards compatible. If your player doesn't know how to deal with that prefix tag, provided your default route has a sensible URL in it, it will totally work. But it's complex. You still need to update every player to be compatible with it. You need to introduce a pattern matching syntax. And it doesn't have support for multi-CDN tokens because it only works on a prefix. Okay. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a bunch of CDNs were chatting and kind of said, hey, this doesn't feel great to us. Maybe we should meet up and chat about the challenges and see how we might approach them. And there were two assertions there. One is, hey, we want to support changing tokens programmatically. We want them to be able to be short-lived, long-lived. We want to be able to have different token durations on top of a manifest and rendition manifests. And hey, maybe we can iterate on Apple's design, and maybe we can improve it. I think most of the major CDNs are represented, obviously CloudFront, Akamai. I was there, people from TheoPlayer were there, and Will Lort was the one kind of leading this experience. Took us 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, we came up with a proposal. It's called RSS. I think this is a great name. We should resurrect the name RSS. It leverages the existing HLS redundant streams approach, but adds signaling in for different pathways, and then uses a significantly simplified version of the steering manifest to achieve content steering. So here is the original proposal. We're working in a Google Doc. I knocked up a simple manifest and experimented with different players to see if these players are actually detecting these as redundant streams or not, because it does involve like a little bit of a change to how players might identify redundant streams. Good news is it fundamentally worked. The players identified these as redundant streams. This came down to the fact that generally these streams were identified by a known set of attributes on the playlists themselves, so bandwidth, codecs, etc., rather than it being all the attributes being identical. So these were still identified as redundant sets inside of the manifest. So this works really well. So The other change was to change the manifest. So the change we made here was simplify it an awful lot and just change it to an ordered set of pathways. This way, you can still fall back to a backup pathway if the primary one fails. It really just becomes a priority ordering. So, the advantages here is it formalizes redundant streams, which has always been kind of this afterthought in the HLS specification. It's overwhelmingly backwards compatible, and any old player that already supports redundant streams gets some form of redundancy built in. They might not understand how to use a steering component of it, but they can still use redundant streams as it was. It does mean you have to generate more verbose top-level manifests. It's not too bad if you're gzipping them, obviously, which you should be doing, by the way. You might have to JIT your manifests, depends on where you inject and how you generate your manifests. And you fundamentally need to know all of your pathways when playback starts. You can't dynamically add and remove pathways in this approach. I would love to hear if people have use cases where they might want to do that, because we kind of came to a conclusion that it's very rare to want to add like a whole new CDN distribution mid-playback session, but I would love to hear if people have use cases for that. So March 24th, we sent over the RSS proposal to Apple, and the Streaming Video Alliance voiced kind of their support for the approach on April 8th. And April 15th, Apple updated the HLS content steering specification to use RSS. And we popped our party poppers and we, fired off some champagne. Yay, we did it. So here it is, content steering 1.2b1. Pretty much looks how we proposed it. There is a new content steering manifest pragma, defines the default pathway, which is in this case CDN-A, and defines the URL to get the steering manifest. And then, yes, we just add the pathway IDs onto each of the redundant renditions. Pretty simple. Steering manifest looks almost identical to how we proposed it. Apple said, hey, we should add word priority there rather than it being inferred. So can't really argue with that. So yeah, we pick up the extra word priority, and that's pretty much it. The content steering flow is not the simplest thing in the world, but this is very comparable between all the approaches that were suggested. So player loads top level manifest, requests a steering manifest returns which pathways to use in which priority order. The player picks a pathway, picks a rendition, and starts playing. A player can absolutely choose to do this selection asynchronously to improve startup time. So by using the default pathway, or if the steering manifest is down, you can still start up a little bit quicker. It doesn't matter if you play, for example, one segment off of your maybe more expensive CDN, as long as the rest of them play off a different CDN. And then players are refreshing that steering manifest as appropriate. This says demo. My demo turned out not to work, and I didn't have time to fix it, and I feel really bad about that. But yeah, there are some demos floating around. Akamai has a demo that does show an older version of the steering manifest working. I was hoping to show a new version, but I couldn't quite get it done in time. This is in iOS 15 developer seeds, so if you do want to try it, it should work for you on iOS 15. In summary, HLS has a new content steering specification. This allows you to implement server-driven HLS multi-CDN in a device-native way. It's simple, it's backwards compatible, and it gives a good amount of value to old clients as well. But the one thing I want people to take away from this is that people are giving feedback to Apple, and Apple are more than ever listening to that community feedback. They listen to the feedback on low latency HLS, they listen to feedback on redundant streams, and there's a bunch more stuff going on in the mailing list now. If you're not a member, you should all go join the HLS mailing list, give feedback on new features, if not just to see what might be coming down the road. If you are interested in both these topics, so go and watch the video from the guys from AWS at DMUX 2019. It gives a lot more detail on how you might achieve more complex redundancy and resiliency scenarios in your ingest chain, as well as your packaging and encoder chain. Definitely worth a watch. Some great demos in there. But also, yeah, go sign up for the HLS mailing list. And I think that is it from me. If anyone has any questions, I'm sorry I don't have a demo. I really am sorry I don't have a demo. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in Slack. I will go check Slack now. I didn't make a thread because I can't do 3 things at once. Or you can always email me or ping me on Slack.